Writing is a great interest. Whether it's as a hobby, a career, or as part of a larger project, the fictional world is a fascinating space to create in. Designing landscapes and societies, technologies and characters, writing romance and adventure, mysteries and thrillers, all of them are interesting both to create and to consume. If you have some idea of a story or setting, it's exciting to think about expressing that in something you can share with others or look back on once you're finished writing. But the translation from idea to creation is where creative endeavors usually run into difficulties. Writing, like any other skill, requires some minimum amount of effort to pick up. And unlike some hobbies where you can see pretty immediate results, like learning a short guitar riff long before you can play full complex songs, in writing there is a trend towards a far higher bar before you're considered to have done anything. The default path for anyone who is interested in writing is to write a novel. A full text with a pretty hefty word count, a story structure, characters, character arcs, plotlines, settings, style of prose, and so on. Even for those just starting out who might receive advice about focusing on a first chapter or just doing a few words each day, the understanding is still that the end goal is to write a full novel. Now, novels are great, and as someone that reads a lot, I'm always happy for there to be more authors giving it a shot, but I don't believe they should be the default. If you have a story or a world you want to share, there are a plethora of different approaches to choose from, and each of them come with their own strengths and requirements. There are options outside of writing entirely, but even within that sphere, novels aren't the only format. Depending on what ideas you have and what you enjoy doing, a different approach or medium may be far more suited to you. The exact length of a novel varies, but most publishers look at a range of about 50,000 to 100,000 words. Much higher word counts are certainly possible, but much lower than that and it leans into novella length. That's a lot of words to put to paper. Challenges like NaNoWriMo, which aims to write a 50,000 word novel in a month, have you write about 1,600 words per day. Now that's a challenge, so not really realistic for a new author. A more reasonable spread across 3 months gives about 550 words per day. That's still a pretty steep number for most people. And daily for 3 months is a big commitment. Considering that that's just the raw writing time, not accounting for any plotting, research or editing, and a whole novel becomes a lot of work. Now I don't want this to sound discouraging. Many novels are written over the course of years, and if it's something you're interested in, I highly encourage you to pursue it. As the assumed default approach, there are a lot of resources out there for how to go about it. But if your interest is in your story or setting first and not specifically in writing a novel, consider writing some shorter content. What that looks like will depend quite heavily on whether there's a concrete story with a specific plot you want to write, or if you have looser or broader world building to explore. If it's a story, consider other perspectives you can give the reader into the world. Bram Stoker's Dracula is presented as a series of letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. While it's still considered a novel, specifically an epistolary novel, it's a very different form of writing, and you don't have to compile your individual snippets into a whole text like that. Short-form content like this can be found on a number of websites. You could publish a blog from a character's perspective, or write audio logs to record for YouTube. As each piece is published, it contributes to the whole story. A well-written story in audio format like the Magnus Archives is just as good an experience as a well-written novel. This kind of presentation also allows you to tie the experience into the real world. By posting on specific dates or tying reality into the setting, people have created a number of ARGs, altered reality games, that get the audience involved in the story. Or simply stick to more regular storytelling. Posting in a serial format has a few structural differences from publishing a whole story at once, but for most people that won't matter. Unless you're trying to make money, an upload schedule is entirely optional, so just post chapters or self-contained short stories as you finish them. Being creative can be difficult. No matter what you're trying to make, there'll be a certain amount of effort and skill involved. But different types of projects require different skills, and some can be better suited to expressing certain ideas. Writing of any form, novel or not, may not be what you or your story and world building are best suited to. Up there next to writing is art as a classic creative pursuit. Drawing or animating is often considered to be more difficult than writing, but people shouldn't let themselves get discouraged. Anything you do requires at least a little effort, and you may find that art is more rewarding to you. The visual medium focuses on and carries different aspects of a story. If you have a lot of focus on introspection and character development, writing lets you really delve into a character's internal monologue. You can do that in a comic too, but it's not as inherently supported. Meanwhile, if your world is heavy on symbolism, or you want to really lean into show don't tell with your character's emotions, being able to draw said symbols or show body language is great. Art doesn't necessarily have to be drawn on a page either. Sculptures or other crafts work just as well. Traditional sculpting out of wood, stone or clay can be surprisingly easy to get into. Pretty much any material can be arranged into shape, so you may find inspiration in using natural materials like sticks and leaves, or making a collage out of pebbles. Using different materials opens up an avenue to symbolism based on what each thing is made of from as well. In the same way that writing short stories lets you think about things differently, working in a 3D space may let you see possibilities you couldn't on a flat piece of paper. For less physical mediums, I mentioned posting audio logs on YouTube, but there are a number of audio formats to choose from. One similar to logs like presentations or something less defined where you just talk to the audience can be great for some people because you don't need a script. You can just think about what you want to cover and start talking. For my videos, I like to write a full script, but when giving a presentation in person, I'll just have a few key notes. Experiment to see what suits you best. While it's all very creative, music is a little more traditionally artistic. Songs are also a great medium for conveying ideas. A simple song that tells about some aspect of the world in its lyrics can be surprisingly easy to get started on, and there are many ways to present something musically. The channel Clamavi de Profundis covers a number of songs from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, which contain a ton of lore about Middle-earth. They also make original songs about their own fantasy dwarven setting. Alternatively, rather than stating events clearly, you can make songs that are more about capturing the vibes of a character or event and making references. The Minecraft SMP format that has been popular over the last few years has led to the creation of many fan songs by artists like The River Cat or Crow. Much like drawing, music is very open-ended, which can make it difficult to know where to start. But if you manage to find inspiration, there's such a variety of music styles out there that you may have a much easier time putting your story into song than writing a novel. While technically just another medium, games are unique enough to warrant their own category. A TV show or play would technically also be valid mediums. You could tell your story in these forms, but they're not really things you ever see made by one person. Funded maybe, but not primarily made by their own hands. Plenty of games, however, do get made by individual people. And I'm not just talking about video games. There's board games, card games, tabletop RPGs, and combinations between them, each of which offer different opportunities and have different requirements. The core aspect they all share in common when it comes to telling a story is lore and mechanical expression. The lore of a game is the conceit for why what is happening is happening. It can take a smaller form as a little bit of backdrop before getting into things, or snippets of flavor text here and there. It can also have a larger presence, the story the entire game is about, or a framing device that informs every event in the game. Mechanics are how the game actually plays, and they can express aspects of the world the game is set in. For example, many video games feature a classic trio of actions. These will be split into the aggressive, defensive, and balanced one. You can design the ideology or approach of each faction and then express their beliefs and actions mechanically. The Order of Knights, who swear to protect the realm, have a defensive playstyle. Meanwhile, the bandits, who only care for themselves, play very aggressively. In writing, this sort of trope expresses itself as hot-headed pyromancers and calm cryomancers. Similar themes apply here. Many trading card games feature factions whose beliefs or priorities are expressed in their gameplay, like the Orzhov from Magic the Gathering. A group of ghosts running a bank, many of their cards feature abilities to force other players to pay resources, and creatures which come back as ghosts after they die. Mechanics that work well at representing the story behind them are considered flavorful. Making game rules that represent the narrative allows you to tell your story through each game played, and to create a different way to access the world. This can be taken pretty far, as seen in games like Undertale, which went to great efforts to subvert some of the usual expectations for how a game would play, in order to tell its story by the absence or changes to certain mechanics. When picking what type of game you might want to make, consider a few things. First, what type of game do you like? Unlike a novel, which after writing you might need some editing or in the worst case rewriting, a game requires constant playtesting. You will be playing your game a lot after every change you make. Second, think about what you need to create for your game. You don't have to be an artist for any of these options. A card game can use simple symbols on the cards. There's lots of free assets available to make a video game, and even code can be pretty much optional if you learn to use an existing game engine. Some of them are really easy to get into, like RPG Maker. But you will have to make some things. An RPG requires a story and dialogue, so even if it's not a novel, you'll have to write a fair bit. Most games will require you to design rules. Of course, that's the point of the exercise. Finding something different you may prefer to novel writing, but understand that these options aren't just easy ways to tell your novel. You can get pretty close to that with a visual novel. These unsurprisingly require a lot of writing, but with the visual aspect you can take out a ton of description and details that might bog you down otherwise to focus purely on dialogue and interactions. You will then have to procure art though. And finally, try to think about what's most important to you to express and how your game might be able to do it. If you have a multitude of characters that you want to share, a card game might be good. Give each character a card and make cards of their equipment or signature moves. If you're proud of the introspective story you've outlined, you don't need much mechanically and can instead create a game that's more interactive story like What Remains of Edith Finch or Umurangi Generation. A board game about competing teams of explorers unveiling tiles on a map is a great medium to share all the unique locations of a fantasy world. Each option has its own requirements and opportunities. A creative endeavor is often a daunting task. Completing a whole novel is a serious effort, but in many ways easier to start. You can come up with the ideas for a story, workshop some characters, and if you're not a procrastinating sort, get a few paragraphs down. Just writing a little isn't that hard. When thinking about making a game or a drawing or a sculpture, people get overwhelmed trying to picture themselves with a final product. It's harder to break the process down into manageable steps, and it's entirely understandable. We all know how to read and write, and we'll all have heard a story before, but few of us are artists or programmers, or know what options exist if you don't want to be either of those things. But these options do exist, and I think it would be great if more people would find them. There are so many great ideas for worlds and stories out there, and many of them will never be seen. A few more might be seen if you can find the right way to express them. I'm sure more options exist besides what I've listed so far, and there's always the option to mix and match any of these. Write a story that serves as setting for a video game which includes a card game like they did with The Witcher. Or to be a little less ambitious, write little bits of flavor text to put in bookshelves for your short RPG Maker game. If game design isn't your thing but the ideas of mechanical expression appeal to you, consider making fan or third-party content. Create a mod for a video game, or make a custom class for a tabletop RPG. If you've ever looked at something and been inspired to think, that looks just like my idea if it were just changed a little bit, maybe you can go and change it. Share your ideas with the world in whatever way you like.